Welcome to the Business Case for PLM, Finding Immediate Value. This is part of a Practical PLM webinar series. This webinar series is hosted by the VDR Group in partnership with ADraft and PacificCAD. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jamie Humphreys with the VDR Group. I'll be the moderator along with David Vanderroos for today's session. Our presenter will be Martin Vanderroos of the VDR Group. This is intended to be an interactive session. Please submit your comments and questions in the panel noted as questions. We will address them once we complete the presentation. We have allocated 20 minutes for Q&A. If we don't get to your questions, we will respond via email. This session will be recorded. Within 48 business hours following this webinar, we will provide you with a link to the recorded session. You will be able to revisit the session as well as share it with others. With that, let me pass on to Martin.
Great, Jamie, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining the session today. We're really excited about kicking this off, and in fact, it is part of a series that we've activated. It represents, frankly, a number of experiences over the past many years in helping organizations with their PLM activities, and we've concluded that, we hear so much about, lofty terms of what PLM is going to do for us, and then there's, of course, the realities that come with it. So we felt that there was an opportunity here to leverage our lessons learned and the lessons learned of our customers and apply it in a practical sense to what can make a difference in pursuing the opportunities with PLM. So with that, let me go ahead and kick it off. We're going to do a quick backgrounder, and then we want to talk a little bit about what we might call the opportunities that are represented in everyone's different cases. We will talk about a couple of case studies of what people are actually doing in moving through this process incrementally, and then, of course, we want to open it up to Q&A. Just briefly about the VDR Group, we've been focused on engineering and manufacturing organizations for over 25 years. We've helped an estimated better than 200 companies with some 222,000 users that is not only part of the implementation work that we might have done, but also products that we've developed and that are used. But we are very much focused on product lifecycle activities. And as I just mentioned, it really is geared to helping organizations achieve the promise of what we would call PLM. And that's really driven by strategies and business drivers. So certainly there's tactical components, but ultimately we're motivated by driving business value at the end of the day. So let me paint a picture, kind of set the stage for what we're seeing and what customers are experiencing. And I've put up kind of a generic picture here of the different disciplines in an organization. We have the sales. Sales is concluded, a PO is let, the project team goes to work, the project management, then we go to engineering, we manufacture and support. And along this process, there's content that's being created, right? There's the requirements that are being developed in the sales process, especially if you're a build to order or engineer to order. Those are the kind of things that are important, of course. Drive those, get those requirements, prepare the proposal, and then it might be handed off to the project team, the planning team that looks at what needs to be done, and of course they have their own database potentially with their project management activities, their scheduling, and so on. Then moves on to engineering. Engineering produces its data, CAD drawings, the bill of materials. And then the group is starting to buy the parts needed or make the parts, and that of course typically would go into an ERP system. And then given this scenario, kind of generic scenario, there's the support activities that come along with it, and documentation, replacement parts, and so on. And so you could see here, of course, what's going on. There's content being developed, but what comes along with this is that this product data, the so-called content, oftentimes sits in disparate databases, right? They're disconnected. Data might be manually re-entered at different places. We've seen this time and again The engineering group releases the bill, but that bill is literally hand entered back in the ERP or potentially imported via a spreadsheet, and so on. And then, of course, because data is disconnected, it becomes pretty tough to do processes, because processes typically span organizations, disciplines. And so we often see this idea of leveraging cultural and community knowledge, right? It's the individuals that have been doing it a while, it's a certain way of doing it, and it's, of course, augmented with, the verbal and facilitated by the emails that might be used. So this is kind of a not untypical situation that we might see. So what are the resulting challenges? We could use multiple, even literally some of the phrases we've heard, but data gets lost in translation. Processes are impacted through the various things that go on in a business. People change roles, there's attrition, and because much of this has been community knowledge, if you will, cultural components, it clearly impacts those kind of things. Because data is spread out and perhaps not all aggregated, there's challenges in being able to make good decisions because of lack of visibility. And then ultimately, of course, right, there's operational efficiencies, and there's many more that I'm sure you can associate with. The impact, and as I mentioned at the very start of this, we're very mindful of the fact there is a business impact. In fact, I just put it down as a P&L item, right? Top level, revenues. And how is revenue potentially impacted? Well, there's time spent developing proposals. If there were a way to do it faster, you'd put out potentially more proposals, potentially missed delivery dates, leaving money on the table. There's assets you've developed. Are there other ways those assets could be leveraged to drive additional revenues, but are hampered because of some of the things we've talked about? Then, of course, at the top line again, cost of goods. You've got the scrap, rework, potentially overstocked inventories, many other things, of course. And then on the bottom line, or in the lower portion of the overhead, you've got the manpower that's been used to support these activities. So these are the business challenges, and they're relevant, right, because they do hit the bottom line in numerous ways. And that's what we're paying a lot of attention to, that, because that really drives these changes. What's another way to look at it? I don't want to get too academia on this topic, but one way to characterize it is to say, I'm going to create a quadrant real quick, and I'm going to show the side of data cohesion, what we call data cohesion. In fact, there's the spectrum of data being disconnected, right? Kind of like we talked about in that previous slide, of data being moved, but typically staying with one discipline, to the whole spectrum of a single source paradigm. Some people use the term single source of truth. So let's imagine there's this data cohesion axis. Then let me propose a vertical axis in this quadrant, what I might call process repeatability. How repeatable is a process? And we might say on one end of the spectrum, lower end of the spectrum, there's the manual or the verbal, the cultural, the community knowledge that goes along with it, all the way up to processes that are highly repeatable, typically because they're automated. And so if we consider this spectrum, we might say, well, this upper right-hand quadrant is really the promised land. It's potentially where we could achieve the promise of PLM. High data cohesion, highly automated process. But the reality is, many of us, at least the folks that we tend to talk to that are looking for help, tend to be in this strata, right? So down toward, if we go to the x-axis on this quadrant, a number of repositories that are not connected, that are standalone, that are isolated, coupled with the processes down there at the bottom. There might be occasions of seeing an organization that's got a single source of truth on that bottom right-hand corner, and still manual processes. Does that work? Potentially, if it's a smaller organization, one database does everything. But the reality is, most of us aren't there, and so that's the idea here. That how do we go about achieving and moving into this top right quadrant. And that's what we're going to be talking about here in how can we drive value with PLM. Let me revisit PLM real quick. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. You're all familiar with product lifecycle management, but at the end of the day, the idea is to put PLM in a place that does support this high data cohesion and repeatable processes that touches the different disciplines, organizations in a company. And it doesn't just start at engineering or end at manufacturing. It really can be all of these. Everything from the time a proposal is put together that leverages requirements that have been used over and over and over again, parts or assemblies, right? Likewise, all the way to support, field support, and publishing documentation that leverages the content of the parts and the product that have already been designed. So that's the opportunity, and that's where PLM fits in. Of course, the value, let's talk about the operational value. The day-to-day value is we do have this single source of truth, right? All the data is stored either virtually or connected. So I don't want to suggest everything needs to be in a single database. It could be virtually connected, number of ways to do that. And then two, we get the repeatable process. In fact, you get them reinforced. Think of it as a way of casting your processes in a way that they will be repeatable. A significant part of your IP, I would contend your intellectual property, are the processes that you've put into place. And then, of course, hopefully out of this, not only do we get some of the other benefits we've talked about, but we do improve collaboration and hence the potential for innovation, which is ultimately what keeps you all competitive. Business value, this is going back to the P&L. You drive additional revenues. Confidently, you'll drive additional revenues. You'll reduce cost of goods, right? We talked about scrap, rework, inventory. That improves margins. You get more from the overhead expense, greater efficiencies, doing more for less, and then ultimately improve that competitiveness. So that's what we see as the promise of PLM and some of the contributors that keep us from getting there, as we just talked about. So how do we respond? And so let me talk about some ideas here in driving value. So this, we titled this thing specifically, pursuing the promise of PLM, but how do we drive the value that goes along with the opportunities? So let's build on that a little bit. I want to paint a picture of the backdrop, if you will. This is almost an essential, critical, from lessons learned, experiences that we've had. There's got to be senior management buy-in. This is a SimData calls PLM a strategy. It's not a tactic, it's a strategy. And so strategy, and especially what we just talked about, PLM touches the P&L, and senior management needs to be bought in. Senior management needs to support the initiatives. We believe that's absolutely critical. The part of that strategy is also very deliberate, right? So it's very specific. Not only, yes, do we want to achieve this, we want to pursue it, but it's deliberate, meaning there's some allocated resources. And I'll put dedicated resources. We've seen organizations try to pursue this, and an individual is doing not only engineering management, but also trying to put together a solution. Our urging is put someone, people, whatever can be spared or supported through this initiative, this strategic initiative, is get dedicated resources on board to support it. So with that, let's drill in a little bit. If I go back to this quadrant idea, we've talked about the idea. Okay, now let's, for the sake of example, we can say, well, we're in this location, this bottom left-hand corner, that blue oval space, right? There's a lot of disconnected or number of disconnected repositories. Processes aren't necessarily repeatable, and we want to get here. We want to get to that top right corner. Literally, we could say this is going to be an incremental step. This is a process. In fact, if we leverage this kind of annotation, we might say it's a combination of improving repeatability coupled with improving the quality and accessibility of the data. It's a step, right? Now, which step do you take first in this process? You can say, well, I've got data. Do I put processes on that data? It possibly could be that way. Or we've got data. Let's shore up the data and improve the processes. So you can see by what we're suggesting here that it's not meant to be trite or clever, but it is a step operation. And what we have seen in our experience suggests that the crawl in this crawl, walk, run process is the data. It's shoring up the data. It's starting with what you have. You've already got parts. You got bills of materials, configurations, maybe other repositories, right? Tech docs or ISO documentation or test or whatever it happens to be. You've already got data. We don't want to create more data. It already exists. So what we're suggesting here is update the quality of this data. So in that first step, rather than go to the process step, go to the improve, shore up the data step. And we're suggesting things like update the properties or the classifications, accessibility consideration, life cycle stages even. You can do life cycle stages, by the way, without workflows. So there's a number of ways that data can be tackled incrementally and set into place. There's some data cleansing activities that might need to take place in your organization. You know, if we looked at the data, what percent is accurate would be a way to look, you know, to measure it. And we typically do not hear 100%. It tends to be less, in fact, in some cases far less, but that's a separate topic. But the point is, there's a data cleansing activity that might be required, and then stand it up on a PLM platform, right? So you've got your data. It might be in a SQL database. It might be accessed. It might be a spreadsheet. But the idea is, let's shore it up, let's clean it up, and then let's put it into a platform now, the beginnings of this PLM concept, and get it ready for what we would call the next stage. This is the walk stage. This is the process stage. This is where we put the processes on top of the data. So we're trying to close that, move up those steps toward that top right quadrant, right? So the fun thing about this is it's truly an opportunity to rethink processes. This is, you know, you've spent a lot of time there, and you know what works, what doesn't work, but it's an opportunity to secure those processes. And frankly, you know, it's a way of rethinking things, right? Knowing what I know now, what would I do differently? Are there some things you would do differently? And now that you have an opportunity to automate that, I think is important. The other thing we suggest is keep it simple. Certainly workflows, processes can do so much, very powerful, but there's a cultural aspect that we wouldn't deny, that people need to get adjusted to the changes that take place. So we like to think of something that's simple, and it might be, you know, moving a part from a InDesign to, you know, in review, ready for release, and then release. 3 steps or 3 life cycle stages, and steps that go in with the workflow. And then expand to include potentially now other methods of making the process, the workflow, more robust with potentially escalation situations, delegation. There's so many other things that you could do. But that's the idea of the walk. So the crawl, you have the data, shore it up. The walk, get started with some processes. I'm intentionally going to skip the run part. That's going to be used for another webinar. But so let me move on to the approach. So what do we recommend for an approach? Well, we've been successful with this agile methodology. It's like lean. Perhaps you're familiar with that idea. But agile basically says let's take things and create bite-sized components of what we're trying to tackle. And by the way, the Agile, I missed that. The Agile methodology is really ideally suited to in situations where the requirements and processes are pretty much in place, right? Yes, there's opportunities for changing things, but it's not like we're starting from greenfield with nothing. So Agile has a tendency to do well in those kind of settings. And so we use this idea of what we call user stories and sprints. You know, literally a user says, you know, I need to be able to open up a new part screen. I need to be able to enter the details of that part. I need to move it to engineering for review, right? Those kind of things, stories that, and there's a format that goes along with that approach. And then the resultant sprint, meaning, okay, I've got my user stories. I now go ahead and activate those and work those into the PLM software stack that you might be using. And as a result, you are able, literally, you are able to create success milestones and immediate value in weeks, not months. In fact, we like to look at sprints as being typically about 3 weeks, and that's from the time your stories are told, the team goes to work 2 weeks, and then you might have a Q&A application and training in parallel in the 3rd week. Week 4, people come back Monday, and boom, you're potentially on with one aspect of your PLM vision. So that's an approach that we've liked. Let me touch on a couple of cases, and again, I'll keep it in the crawl and the walk, not the run, the crawl and the walk. So case 1, here's a build-to-order organization, and this is based on experience of the last several years. Some of the numbers might have been, you know, kind of rounded up or what have you, but build-to-order organization, 60%, they do custom work on top of their standard product line. Their challenges were operational inefficiencies. Part numbers were drawing numbers. There was no such thing as a part, as an item master as you have in ERP, right? You treat item masters in ERP, you don't treat drawings in ERP. But engineering is using drawing numbers that are represented by drawings. There's a loss of data translation. Data sits inside drawings. You know, how do you get that out? How do you ensure accuracy? And so on. And then there was a manual reentry of the bill of materials from engineering to the ERP system. Well, you can imagine, the number of challenges this organization had that went with it. So what have they done? These folks, actually a couple organizations have done this. They've gone ahead and created items in the engineering phase from the drawings. So now it's a pivot table, so to speak. It's not drawings pointing to part numbers. It's part numbers that have a drawing. In fact, that part number might have a spec, a test sheet, whatever it happens to be. So the idea is to be part centric, and so this is that one idea of first step, the crawl step, shore up the data. Here's case 2, an engineer to order organization, 40,000 parts that go into a single delivery, huge piece of equipment. And the individual that is leading this has used this term. Significant manpower is being used to get the product out the door, and lots of community knowledge. It's individuals who know something about, say, a subassembly, and if that individual were not available to come to work, it would literally impact the management of that subassembly. Very significant. So interestingly enough, these folks have tackled both the data and the processes. So they felt their data was pretty clean, interestingly enough, because it was being managed. It just had a lot of manpower to manage it. So they refined some of the data definitions, improved that information, but then they focused on the repeatable processes. So they went into that walk phase, and a perfect situation of the opportunity that was available to them. So with that, let me kind of draw it to a closure and pull it all together and what we're trying to communicate. One is, we see the promise of PLM. It does not need to be couched in these lofty, unattainable terms, expensive, etc. There's practical methodology to get there. And part of that includes getting that senior management support and the buy-in, the dedication of resources, etc. And then we talk about this crawl and the walk part. We'll talk about the run later. But build on what you have. You've got the data already in place. There's no need to, to go out and create more data. You've got the data. It's already in different forms of repository, whether it's a database, a file directory, a spreadsheet, and take time to get it ready to work in a PLM environment. Do some of the data cleansing activity. And I'm not trying to trivialize these. These do take some resources and time, but that really is the basis for moving toward the potential with PLM. And then you build your processes and workflows on top of that. So it's take advantage of what you have, but in the practical sense that we're trying to encourage is those two parts, right? The data, shore up the data, do a process. Shore up the data, do a process. Shore up the data, do a process. And then leverage something like an agile. If you have other techniques, that's fine. But I think the spirit of intent here is not to get bogged down in months of work. Create success milestones, create value in a short period of time. So that concludes what we wanted to share with you all in this first part of the series that we're unfolding, setting the stage for what it means for PLM, setting the stage for what it means to respond to it with practical steps that can help you get to that. So with that, I'll pause at this point and open it up to questions, comments, and so on. So Jamie, I'll pass it back to you.
Terrific. Thank you, Martin. Okay, we've set aside the remainder of this time for our questions and answers. So let's get some here. Okay, here's the first question. In a couple of the slides, you talk about life cycle and workflows. What's the difference? Martin?
Good question. Excellent question. So when we think of life cycles, think of a part that has a life cycle, right? So a part that gets, it's in design state, and from design it might go into review, and from review it goes into release. I'll keep it simple. It's the state of that part. It could be a state of a document. It suggests also life cycles, the way we at least interpret life cycle, it also suggests something about access rights to that item in the life cycle. So if a part is in engineering state, we don't want people in manufacturing to get a hold of that. It's still not ready to be had, right? But once it's in a release state, it's ready to be had. So I think of life cycles as a state of that item as well as accessibility that goes with it. Then when I think of workflow, I think about how I move that item through a process, right? So the process, the workflow of that item, that part, let's take that part example again. Engineering starts the design of that part. So engineering gets the task, design the part. But as you all know, and you have your own nuances of how you do that review, it might go to a senior engineer, then it might go to someone in manufacturing to see if you can make it, then it goes back to engineering to make refinements, and that could all be in the state of review. So that part is still in review, and then once everybody buys it out or buys off on it, and it might be that part might literally be a change request part or a change order part, however you do it in your organization, but then it's finally released. So one is the state of an object, and access to is the actual way that part, drawing, document, what have you, moves through the activities to create those stages. Hope that helps.
Perfect. You didn't talk about the run phase. what is it? That's the next question.
Yeah, I probably, good point. I should have been more clear. The run phase is if we go back to that one chart of the quadrant, what I touched on in the two cases was the crawl. What I see the crawl being shore up the data, the walk, tackle the process. The run gets involved in how do we start bridging the data repositories? How do we move down that x-axis on the data cohesion axis, if you will, that achieve this idea of a single source of truth, so to speak. And that, of course, is a different topic than what we're talking about here, but we'll cover it in one of the future webinars when we talk about this specific topic of, how do we bring this data together? What are some techniques that people are using to bring this data together? So that's what we might refer to as the run phase.
Okay, we've got one more here. It says our data is in CAD Vault, network directories, and ERP. How do we put this all in one database?
So good question, and it probably follows the thing that I just mentioned about the run. I don't want to ignore the question, but there's ways that we could look at how to create this concept of a virtual repository. So if you're using a CAD Vault, which I imagine might be something like I don't know, like AutoCAD, Autodesk's Vault integrated with Inventor or AutoCAD or ePDM from SolidWorks, or it might be Team Center if they're using it just for a Vault to manage NX drawings. But there's a way we could connect data in different ways to ERP. Data that might be sitting in directories might be ideally suited to be sucked into a PLM type of solution. But not that I don't want to get into details, but we'll have a separate webinar session just on that topic, what we call the run phase of this process.
Martin, we've only got time for one more question. Following the webinar, we will respond via email to all the other questions that weren't addressed today. The last question that we have today is, what techniques have you seen to get senior management buy-in?
Say it again, please.
What techniques have you seen to get senior management buy-in?
Well, good question. So I put that down, right, as part of the backdrop to getting this started. If you don't get started with that, it's pretty tough, at least in my experience, what we've seen. Buy-in is done, I suppose, where the senior management has, and I don't want to discount it, but I would certainly believe that senior management has an interest in what's going on at the P&L level. In fact, the way I've seen it, many senior management have some level of P&L responsibility, whether it's revenue, salesperson has revenue responsibilities, the shipping people, the people who might install the product once it's completed, if it's an engine order, that individual might be held responsible for the total cost of goods that are represented by scrap, rework, lengthy time spent trying to install something that maybe data got lost. So I think if we could address it, if senior management can be approached and shown that connection between what's going on in terms of the way product is being managed and how product is life cycle is being managed, and what that means to some portion of the P&L, and create that connection and identify that this is being tackled, this is being proven out, that senior management would almost be not to be too critical, but would almost be remiss not to tackle that. if that were their responsibility and that information were available to them. So I think it needs to be tackled from the business side, the P&L side in particular.
Great. Thank you, Martin, for your thoughts and insight.
Sure. Any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
I think that we're going to have to wrap it up. That was our last question for today. Did you want to say anything else, Martin?
No. Thank you all for taking time to be on this, and thank you, Jamie, for hosting this.
I'd like to thank everyone for attending as well and making the time out of their busy schedules. Once again, a recording of this webinar will be made available to you within the next 48 hours. This concludes our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.